What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into my YouTube channel. So what did Jonathan Edwards think about slavery? And what did Jonathan Edwards think about the Native Americans? Well, great questions, and I want to thank you for checking into this channel. Again, my name is Matt. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, a Reformed church just north of Pittsburgh. Love to have you come visit us sometime if you're looking for a Presbyterian church and you're somewhere north of Pittsburgh. That'd be a wonderful thing for you to come and worship with us. All right, let's get into this. So a new book just came out, which is excellent. It's called Jonathan Edwards Within the Enlightenment: Experience, Controversy, and Thought, edited by John T. Lowe and Daniel Galata. Now, full disclosure here, my essay is in this book. It's the last essay in the book, and so part of me is promoting this, but the other part of me is just really interested in continuing to learn about Edwards, and I have not yet read many of the essays and articles in this book, so I'm working through them right now. And because it focuses on some of the controversies related to Jonathan Edwards, two of the first essays that I really wanted to dig into were the ones on slavery and the ones on the treatment of Native Americans. So I've already read those first. So what I'm going to share in this video is basically just a distillation of what I've recently learned. So let's talk about Edwards and the institution of slavery first of all. Edwards had, by any standard, a mixed legacy when it comes to slavery. Now, of course, there's part of me that wants to defend Edwards. I love Edwards. I've spent much of my life writing and thinking about Edwards, at least my professional academic life. So Edwards is a bit of a hero of mine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're supposed to readily accept and endorse everything even some of our heroes believed and taught. So here's the deal with Jonathan Edwards and slavery. He has a tarnished legacy in this regard. Although there are a few positive things we can say about him and slavery, it does come down to the negative fact, and it's an unavoidable fact, that Edwards himself was a slave owner. He owned at least one slave, and her name was Venus, and we know that the Edwards family acquired her because there was a receipt of purchase in one of his personal details of some of his financial comings and goings and things like that. So we know he was a slave owner, and that's obviously to his detriment. No part of me will ever attempt to defend that. I think all modern thinkers, we can together recognize that slavery in all of its forms, both historical and present. Don't forget there are slaves today, sexual slavery, for instance. All slavery in its historical forms are to be roundly and soundly condemned. Having said that, there are a few positive things to Edwards' ledger. First of all, the Northampton Church, of which he was a pastor, actually received Africans as members based on their profession of faith. So that's a pretty progressive thing to do, is actually to recognize and receive African members into the membership of the church. So that's a wonderful thing. Edwards himself was against the cruelties of the institution of slavery. However, he did not argue for its full dismantling. And one of the reasons why Edwards did not work harder to try to dismantle slavery as an institution is because one of the foundational concepts that he accepted under the rubric of the sovereignty of God is what we might call today hierarchical institutions within the civil government. So Edwards, of course, remember, he was a subject to the British throne. Although he was a colonial, he's pre-1776, so he's not an American revolutionary. He died before the Revolutionary War. So one of the things that Edwards accepts, just de facto, is that there are institutions that God has established in the world. And so Edwards accepts that some men are born kings and other men are born paupers. And Edwards accepted, and I'm not arguing for this, but I'm just saying Edwards accepted the fact that God created men in different states or stations of life, and one of those was slavery. So he assumed slavery as a hierarchical institution in his day. Now you might say, how could he be so foolish to accept that? Well, remember, every single generation has its blind spots. And the reason that they're called blind spots morally and ethically is because we can't see them ourselves. Sometimes it takes the reflection of another generation, a subsequent generation, to see the errors of the first. I happen to believe that 100 years from now, Christians will look back on the United States today and wonder how we could ever tolerate abortion, for instance, as a nation. And so sometimes generations critique and correct each other, and here what we can see as an obvious error with the tolerance of slavery, apparently the colonial Christians, Puritans, could not recognize that in their own day. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that that's the end of the story for Edwards and slavery, because Edwards wrote some foundational ideas that his disciples would then take into the abolitionist movement. So when we come to Edwards' great book, The Nature of True Virtue, which is his philosophical book on ethics and morality, Edwards says that true ethics, true moral duty is to love God with all of your heart and to love essentially everyone and everything that God has made. It was a concept called benevolence to being in general. That runs throughout the nature of true virtue. The idea there is you love what is, and what is God and what God has made, including fellow human beings. So Edwards argues for benevolence to being in general, a principle that his disciples, namely his son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., and another disciple by the name of Samuel Hopkins, they would take that and they would apply it in ways that Edwards himself did not do. So, to Edwards' favor, to his credit, his ideas were carried further than he himself was willing to carry them into the abolitionist movement. And so by the time you have Jonathan Edwards Jr., his son, and Samuel Hopkins writing, they're taking this concept of benevolence to being in general and now applying it to Africans, different races, and even to slavery, so that Samuel Hopkins even argued before the Continental Congress for the complete abolition and dismantling of the institution of slavery. Yes, yes, and even though it didn't come quite then, we can see that Jonathan Edwards' ideas were fully applied by his disciples in a way that perhaps he did not have the courage to apply them. Okay, now let's move on to the Native Americans, and there's a good essay in this book on Native Americans as well. Here again, we have a mixed legacy because, like most colonials, Edwards assumed, as a matter of fact, that the Native American cultures were essentially inferior to that of the Europeans, which, of course, being a colonial, he essentially was. He assumed their inferiority. Edwards never had any desire to learn, for instance, the Native American languages, although, again, his son, he did want Jonathan Edwards Jr. to learn the Mohican language so that he could be a translator. So Edwards, as you know, eventually became a missionary to the Indians, to the Native Americans himself. He lost his job at the Northampton Church because of the communion controversy of 1750, and so he ended up taking a position as missionary to the Native Americans. He had a small English congregation, but also his job was to teach and to instruct the Native American peoples. And one of the things that we notice, and it's argued well in the article in this book that I've been referencing, is that Edwards's views towards the Native Americans seems to have improved the more he came into contact with them in real life. So for instance, Edwards himself, and especially his wife, were quite liked by the Native Americans that he taught in Stockbridge because of the way that they simply treated them. One of the things Edwards did to treat them well is he actually began to research some of the treaties that this particular area had been a part of, and he noted their severe injustices on the part of the white Europeans. Mistreated, mishandled, lied to, etc. Edwards noted that, and he, at least personally, although he couldn't affect societal and cultural change, he at least personally treated them quite well. And by the end of his time as a Stockbridge missionary, get this, he was able to call the Native Americans his brothers. And so yes, although Jonathan Edwards has a mixed and somewhat tarnished legacy in the concept of race relationships, nevertheless, the one thing that we can say about him is that his ideas were more consistently applied than he himself was able to do in his own lifetime by his subsequent disciples. Well, I hope that helps a little bit. I hope that's a good enough explanation. You can certainly read more about that in the new book from the New Directions in Jonathan Edwards series. by the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University. Full disclosure, I've got an article in that book, but it's a great book. I will say it's a bit expensive at $125, but that's kind of the field of academic literature. Sorry about that. Nothing I can do. But I'll post a link to this book in the description of this video. If you want to get something that's a little bit cheaper, you can read about some of these concepts as well in the great biography by George Marsden. So I'll post a link to this in the description as well. As always, yours truly, Pastor Matt here. Love you lots. Thanks for checking in, and we'll talk to you later.